All right. Hi, everyone. I'm going to take you from 130,000 feet down to the ground. But before I get into that, I know Michael's done a great introduction, so I just want to thank you again for coming out today. As I understand it, there's a Columbia game going on right now. So the Colombian, so for Columbia German. I appreciate those of you who actually came out to listen to us today. Judging by those who are not here, we know how many people are fans of either team. And obviously, you also know who doesn't pay attention to soccer at all, particularly when it comes to scheduling. So, yeah, I really appreciate the turnout. So I'm going to talk through the report findings for about 25-30 minutes, and then we're going to turn it over to our discussants to talk a little bit about how what we found relates to their business activities. But before I do that, just a quick thanks again to Hunt & Williams for hosting the event. We put these reports together, and we don't get to talk to people that often in large groups about what we found, and it's great to have such a diversity of people in the room, both to listen to what we found and then to sort of feed it back to us from their own perspective. I also want to thank the donors and supporters and sponsors who made this report possible. As Michael mentioned, we've been doing this for 8 years. And when you do anything for 8 years as a nonprofit, there's people who really appreciate it and want to see it happen again every year. So there's some kind of consistency given to the market in the good years and the bad. Or not bad, but difficult. And we've had some supporters even on this list who've been supporting us for several years now, regardless of how the market has performed, and we're incredibly grateful to those organizations. Sorry, I can't get this. There we go. So just to tell you a little bit about Ecosystem Marketplace, we're an initiative of Forest Trends. Forest Trends has lots of initiatives that focus on different aspects of forest finance and forest carbon mitigation projects and programs. And Ecosystem Marketplace sort of takes a step back from those implementation activities and tracks how they're being financed, how they're being paid for, and particularly looking at market-based mechanisms. As I'll get into in the presentation, that in itself has changed even over the last 18 months or so. As we have had to be as creative as the marketplace in trying to figure out where things are going and how the support to these programs is changing. So we track payments for carbon offsets, watershed investments, habitat mitigation banking, all kinds of different mechanisms through annual reports and also through our suite of websites. The biggest of them is ecosystemmarketplace.com. Hopefully you all are familiar with that one. We also have the Forest Carbon Portal, Watershed Connect, speciesbanking.com. There's a lot of them. So I encourage you to check them out based on what your interests are. And then beyond that, we have news briefs as well. If you're interested in receiving weekly, bi-weekly news updates from any of these marketplaces, there's a tab on our website that will take you to the sign-up. So that's what we do, specifically with the report methodology itself. In order to track a global marketplace that is completely disaggregated and highly illiquid, we put out a global survey every year. We have a list that sort of expands and contracts depending on who has entered the market, who leaves the market, and we send our survey to all of them. And every year we get between 250 and 320 responses, and they tell us about how they performed in the market in the previous year. This year we got over 250 survey responses from suppliers and buyers in 57 countries and projects that were based in 60 countries, which is a record in terms of project locations for us. And this is one of the important indicators, we think, is the geographic scope of the market itself, and so we were excited about that finding. We also get data from exchanges and registries and put out the survey itself in 3 languages. Depending on the support that we have each year, we also do outreach in additional languages as well. So you'll see that the volume of responses and the volume of offsets that we've tracked as transacted in certain regions have gone up. We are confident that that is due to market activity and not to our expanded outreach in these regions, because this is something that we've been doing for several years now. We're agnostic on credit quality, which means that if you tell us that an offset was transacted, we take you at your word. However, there are some cases where we perform due diligence to ensure that the transaction actually did take place, particularly if it varies from everything else that we're seeing in the marketplace and is definitely a statistical outlier. We have had a few such cases over the last couple of years that have influenced our data by around 14 million tons over the last 2 years. So that data is absent from our report. Take that for what you will, but if we can't confirm it, then we don't include it when it's that sizable. Finally, all of our findings are volume weighted, which means that if you see a price, it's been weighted according to the significance of the transaction. So if you transacted 1 million tons at $1 a ton, it's going to be given more weight than if you transacted 10 tons at $100 a ton. And so just to talk through some of the key takeaways from the report. As Michael mentioned, market activity has slowed. But the extent to which that's actually the case varies depending on what kind of data you include in the data set. We have learned over the last month that we've been talking about these findings that reporters get really frustrated when you start getting into details like that. But nonetheless, it's incredibly important to understand why these things are happening. In previous years, when talking about either an increase or a decrease in demand, we have had a million reasons why that could be the case, and it varied by the buyer and the transaction and the supplier, the product type, et cetera, et cetera. And we just talked it up to changes in market activity. This year, there were a couple of major reasons why demand for offsets in the voluntary carbon market decreased this year. And it's not actually that demand decreased for voluntary carbon offsets. It's that it transitioned to the compliance market. When California went live, all of those transactions of offsets in 2013 were counted as compliance offset transactions instead of voluntary. Where in previous years we counted those offset transactions as pre-compliance, which meant that buyers and suppliers were preparing for the market to be active, but it was all voluntary because there wasn't actually a compliance obligation in place. And last year, those tons were not in our report. So in previous years, we had tracked around 9 to 10 million tons a year that were from that motivation that we didn't see last year. Also because of similar activities that we saw in Australia due to the carbon price in Australia, with the political turmoil that surrounded the carbon price in 2013, we didn't see the same kind of pre-compliance activity. And so that was another source for the decline. And then the third piece of it was the Chicago Climate Exchange. And I'll actually talk a little bit more about these trends in a second when I pull up the chart. But suffice it to say that the total drop that we saw in the marketplace last year was not necessarily related to a decrease in purely voluntary demand for offsets. If we were to attribute a proportion to the actual purely voluntary activity in the marketplace that fell, it would be around 5%, versus the 26% that we had to report as a headline number. So it's important to keep those sort of more technical aspects of our findings in mind. One of the interesting things that we did see in our data this year was a change in buyer motivation. In terms of buyer motivation, we track that based on responses from the suppliers. So if you sold an offset to a buyer, you tell us about what you think is their motivation, where they're from, what sector they're in, et cetera. And that's the sort of best indicator that we get of how buyers were active in the previous year. Last year, we found that as opposed to CSR, public relations, and branding, or some of the more traditional motivations that we've seen from voluntary offset buyers. In 2013, voluntary buyers were driven by a climate change-driven mission, or to combat climate change. And this is surprising to us because that option has been in the survey for several years, and we've never seen that volume of response associated with it before. But after resale, it was the #1 motivation in the market. Part of that reflects the fact that we don't see the pre-compliance motivation in the same way. But also, we see our eyes because the climate surpassed some pretty dangerous thresholds last year. And based on interviews that we've had with offset suppliers, they say that the companies that are in the market feel more comfortable talking about the real risks that they face in terms of climate change and their direct role in causing and mitigating it. So that was, I think, a highlight of this year's report. Another thing that we've seen, which is both a challenge and an opportunity for the market, is the emergence of commitments to low or zero deforestation commodities. In talking to some European offset suppliers, there's a lot of enthusiasm among companies to make these commitments, to reevaluate or evaluate for the first time where their commodity supply is coming from, the implications of that for forests. And in some ways, attention shifted to that and away from other sustainability activities in that it's simply a trend in corporate CSR. But we also saw some organizations that were incorporating offsetting as a way to incentivize producer change on the ground. We've been talking about that for several years, and this is the first year that we've really seen that in our data. So that was also exciting. And then finally, as Michael mentioned, public sector payments for performance. Last year, we tracked the 8 million ton commitment between Germany's REM program, which is the Red Early Movers, and the state of Acre. And that actually builds on the first commitment that Germany had made in 2012. And while we have in the past only tracked purely voluntary offset transactions in the traditional market sense, we also believe that this kind of transaction fits into our methodology, and I'm happy to discuss this with you guys offline, because we have gotten a lot of questions about it. And the response that we have is simply that we have to rethink the way that we think about voluntary offsetting and markets and payments for forest carbon emissions reductions, as the methods by which people are actually paying for and delivering those things are also changing. So I'm sorry, that was a whole lot to talk about for a slide with no pictures. So I'll just show you a little bit of what the market actually looks like. So you can see here in previous years, in these light green bars, that the Chicago Climate Exchange had a fairly significant impact on market volumes, and also in some years on market value. The Chicago Climate Exchange was the world's first and only legally binding voluntary commitment-driven market. And a lot of that activity was driven by the hope that those offsets would be included in a federal cap-and-trade program. When that didn't happen, interest in the program waned. At the end of 2010, the program was shuttered, or at least the formal trading program. You'll see that there's still some Chicago Climate Exchange offsets in our data, and that's because they still operate their registry and their standards, but the actual trading program itself is no longer active. And so all of those offsets that previously were traded on the exchange began being transacted bilaterally over the counter. And you can see that shift from the light green bar here, which was on exchange, to the volume of offsets that were transacted from the CCX to off exchange in the over-the-counter offset market. And you can see that we've tracked several million tons of that activity in each year. And to some extent, if you look at the pattern of issuance and retirement in that program over time, the volume of activity in the program has similarly sort of waned over the last several years. And we can see that in the transaction volumes in our data as well, where you can see that in 2012 we tracked 8 million tons that were transacted and reported through the Chicago Climate Exchange. And in 2013 we saw less than 1 million tons transacted there. In some ways this is what we think sort of a delayed reaction to the closure of the program. Beyond that, you can see the orange bars are other kinds of over-the-counter pre-compliance transactions. And that is primarily California and Australia. You can see actually that in 2012, the volume grew to 15 million tons, and that growth is mostly attributed to Australia. So it was a shame that we didn't track anything from that marketplace in this last year, but a lot of those tons would have actually been attributed to the compliance market anyway. So overall, in terms of pre-compliance, we saw less than 1 million tons transacted. The important thing to know about that 0.3 million tons there is that that was primarily attributed to developing country pre-compliance activities. So as we look at programs like the Partnership for Market Readiness or the Business Partnership for Market Readiness, their focus is on these countries, particular countries that may be implementing carbon markets or offset trading programs of some kind. We're particularly interested in those like Costa Rica, like Thailand. They're actually evaluating using voluntary mechanisms in order to achieve their commitments. And it's in those regions where we see this pre-compliance activity occurring. Here you can see that even though the Chicago Climate Exchange was very active and decently priced as well in the early years, that once it was clear that those offsets were not going to be eligible for a federal cap-and-trade program, that the prices fell substantially to the extent that it never really contributed much to market value after 2007, 2008. And so the values that we've tracked in the marketplace over time are primarily attributed to purely voluntary activity and pre-compliance offset transactions. As a result, too, you can see that the price fell slightly, and that comes from a number of sources. One of them is simply the fall in prices that we saw globally, depending on the project type. And also because of the absence of pre-compliance tons. If you look at previous years, offsets that were transacted for pre-compliance purposes have always tracked closely against anticipated compliance allowance prices. And in the absence of that pricing, the price fell similarly. One thing that we do want to emphasize, however, is offset retirement. So this is a major difference between the voluntary offset market and the compliance offset market, in that when offsets are transacted, the buyer is incentivized to retire those tons, which means to take them out of circulation and retire them so that they can't be transacted again. And they're held on a registry in their name in perpetuity. So this chart actually compares the volume of offsets for which emissions reductions were verified and then issued to the offset owner, at which point they could be delivered or transacted depending on how the contract was structured. So you can see the way that issuance has changed by standard over time. VCS, the Verified Carbon Standard, the most widely used offset program in the world, has had significant issuance volumes over the last several years, and you can see that in the dark blue column here. And then the striped blue column that's next to that shows the volume of VCS offsets that have been retired. And you can see too that in 2013 the volume of offsets that were retired through VCS rose significantly. Mostly as a result of that growth, retirement volumes more than doubled last year. And since we released our initial findings that market volumes had fallen, there's been a lot of pushback that we should be emphasizing these numbers more. And we do think that this is a very important indicator of market players' ability to generate, issue, and deliver offsets to buyers. There was a time when certain project types were not expected to be able to achieve that, and obviously that is far in our past. Because people don't really think about the argument anymore. So it's an important thing to recognize that the market is capable of delivering on its contracts and its commitments and to deliver these volumes. However, for those volumes that were retired in 2013, we have no way of knowing when they were actually transacted. And so those could have been tons that were transacted in 2007. And it took the project that long to get through the system and actually issue and be able to retire those tons. So it's an important thing to keep in mind. However, it is a really important thing to recognize as an accomplishment for the market as well. In terms of the types of players that were involved in the market last year and who supplied offsets, here you can see that the for-profit organizations were, again, the largest offset supplier, and that's in that solid blue bubble. The outline of blue is from the year before. You can see that the volume supplied by the private sector was slightly more. Last year, as that fell, the volume of offsets supplied by the public sector actually grew pretty significantly. So here you can see this little dot, that was 2012, and this larger dot is 2013. And some proportion of that is the KfW off-grid transaction, but even without it, that subset of the market grew pretty significantly. In terms of the type of offset supplier that we tracked, if you were to look at and compare offset project developers against offset retailers, or sort of the intermediaries who tend to guide corporate entities in achieving their CSR targets, as well as brokers who are pure intermediaries and don't take ownership of the offsets, but simply make connections between buyers and sellers, and then, public sector offset programs. You can see that some of the major change occurred in all of the categories except for the intermediaries. And this is an important thing to recognize as well. For several years, we've been trying to make the point that offset retailers are an important source of stability in the marketplace. When we look at project developers in particular, we tend to see these like very large one-off transactions and not a lot of sustained relationships between major buyers and project developers. Unless the project developer has hired someone specifically in-house to support them with sales and to support their clients in a more holistic, offset-inclusive carbon management program. Retailers, wholesalers are more set up to be able to support clients in that way and tend to be the ones who report having repeat customers. So you can see in terms of the drop in volumes that we track, when it comes to the transfer of offset ownership, that mostly occurred in the project developer category. Across the board, however, you can see where prices fell slightly or more dramatically. And project developers still see higher prices than offset retailers. That has more to do with the types of offsets that are being supplied by project developers versus retailers. So moving on to project type, you can see the forestry and land use was by far the most popular project type or project category in the market last year. And it sort of switched places with renewable energy projects. And there's a couple of reasons for that we'll get into in a minute. The proportion of offsets transacted from the household device category grew. However, if you look at the numbers in the report, the volume associated with those projects actually dropped slightly, but not significantly. And by household device, that refers to water purification devices, the water filtration systems, as well as clean cook stoves. We first began seeing these project types increase in popularity 2 or 3 years ago, and they've maintained about this level of market presence for the last 2 years. We are working with the Global Alliance for Clean Cook Stoves to publish a report that looks at their members and their market performance and the distribution volume for the stoves themselves and types of recipients. That will be coming out this fall, and we're hoping to follow that up with an actual report looking specifically at this sector in terms of carbon market opportunities. Looking at project types themselves, obviously there's a lot more variety than there is in the previous slide. And you can see that a significant proportion of the marketplace is made up by red project offset transactions. It would have been the top project type with or without the KFW upgrade commitment. But I'll talk a little bit about the makeup of that market in a minute. We did see a slight decrease in demand for wind offsets, so offsets generated by wind installations. And you can see the Clean Cook Stove projects were the third type, moving up from the fourth in the previous year. Looking specifically at red projects, one of the big questions that we always get is what proportion of that was VCS, plus the climate, community, and biodiversity standards. Obviously, that particular standard has been very active in the forestry sector since its inception. And for some people, it doesn't even occur to them that when we talk about red, that it's not all VCS. But you can see that the market in 2013 was very similar to the market in 2010, in which about 10 million tons of it was VCS plus climate, community, and biodiversity standards, and the rest was from a variety of other standards. In particular, about 8 million tons of that light green bar in 2013 is the KFW upgrade commitment. The tons that were verified and issued and retired associated with that agreement were under the upgrade carbon standard, which was really a framework that was based on VCS jurisdictional nested bed, the JNR framework. But because upgrade hasn't yet been validated under that framework, they can't actually pursue issuing tons under VCS JNR. But the expectation is that that is going to happen in the next year. In the meantime, those tons are issued and retired as upgrade carbon standards. So when you see that in the report, that's what we're talking about, but in essence, it is VCS. And I'll talk about the rest of that bar when we get into standards, because I know we're a little limited on time. Looking at pricing, it's probably difficult for you to see this chart, so I'll just talk about the highlights. You can see here, looking at the drop from the dark blue bar to the orange bar, that's 2012 to 2013 in terms of red prices. It fell to $4.2 per ton. And we also believe that the volume of offsets that were transacted were in response to the lower price for red. We did statistical analysis on this and found that there was a pretty significant buyer response to the drop in price. The opposite was the case for projects that are traditionally developed to the gold standard, which has always been associated with very high quality, scarce, development-oriented offsets. And as a larger volume of offsets from clean cook stove projects, water filtration projects, et cetera, started to come online, the prices for those projects fell, and so did demand. And we find that looking at the last several years of data that we have for the gold standard, that those offsets do behave very much like a luxury good in this marketplace. Looking again at the red offset transactions and the price drop that we saw there, you can see here that this is the volume of offsets that were transacted at $0 to $3 a ton. This is $3 to $6 a ton, $6 to $9, and $9 to And these little green dots represent the number of offset suppliers who supplied that total volume. So, you know, when we talk about the price being $4.2 a ton, most red product developers are like aghast. But in fact, it was only 4 offset suppliers that transacted 28% of the marketplace at below $3 a ton. And then 62% transacted at closer to the market average. But you can see that in terms of numbers, the number of transactions at higher prices was much higher. So I know I've talked a lot about standards. Here's the chart that actually looks at the market share associated with those standards. And here you can see that 47% of the market was associated with the verified carbon standard. The largest chunk of that, 29%, was VCS all by itself, with the following 16% being VCS plus the climate, community, and biodiversity standards. So it can be assumed that that 16% is forestry. We don't track VCS, forest carbon offsets that are transacted without the CCB standards also being tagged onto it at this point. It's sort of a requirement for market entry and buyer access at this point. The remaining 2% is associated with the social carbon standard. It's a co-benefit standard that is also tagged on to the verified carbon standard, but is not exclusive to forestry. It's also applied to other project types like fuel switching or biomass. And we are seeing roughly the same volume of those offsets transacted in every year. So no significant change there. And then in the following 21% there that's associated with internal or proprietary standards, you can see the off-grid carbon standard is in that larger slice. It represented 13% of the marketplace and around 2/3 of the offsets that were transacted from an other or unknown standard. We have only seen that kind of activity before in 2010, when there were several forest carbon offset standards that we had not seen in the marketplace before, that were only transacted by 1 or 2 offset project developers. But we did see it again last year. So project developers saying that they had used VCS as guidance, but weren't intending to follow through on verification or even validation in some cases. And there's a lot of reasons for that, or at least a lot of reasons that they give, and we do get into that in the report. But to suffice it to say that that 21% is a mix of unknown standards, of organizations using standards with no intention to actually verify, and then 13% of the marketplace as a whole is the off-grid carbon standard. There's another 15% chunk that's associated with the gold standard, and those are all voluntary offsets. So the gold standard certifies both purely voluntary and compliance-based projects, and the compliance projects are actually certified as certified emissions reductions and can be sold into the clean development mechanism. Less than 1% of the offsets that we track were certified to both the clean development mechanism methodologies and the gold standard. The remaining, the 15% that you see there, was all for gold standard voluntary projects. But we did track a larger volume of offsets that were strictly from the clean development mechanism, which, if we look at this price chart, you can see where that volume has risen. But in terms of the price associated with that, we didn't see a collapse in pricing for paid by voluntary buyers that was as dramatic as what was seen in the compliance offset market. You can see that we didn't track anything significant in 2012 in terms of the internal or proprietary standards. So we don't really have anything to compare those against in the current year. But also important to notice is the slightly higher price associated with the VCS plus CCB standard offsets. That mostly has to do with the fact that those are forestry offsets, and they're never going to, well, never say never, but we have not seen them transact at prices as low as strictly VCS renewable energy projects. Another interesting development that we saw last year, and goes back to the risk attributed to the projects themselves, as to whether or not they could actually deliver offsets. Several years ago, when we made this chart that looked at popular project types by the stage that they had achieved at the time of transaction, you would have seen the highest prices being on the latest stage end of the chart, because there was less risk associated with buying offsets that had actually been issued, as opposed to earlier stage projects that had not yet demonstrated that they could surpass validation or achieve verification. And now we see much the inverse as supply becomes available, and as projects demonstrate that they are actually able to achieve issuance. And you can see that the higher prices are back here on the early stage end of the projects. And this is a sort of significant split in the marketplace. When you talk to buyers, they will tell you that it's because there's more value to them in being able to catalyze a new project rather than buying offsets that are from existing projects that other buyers have sourced or their direct competitors may have already used and claimed in their marketing. And so there's a certain degree of uniqueness that's associated with working at this end of the spectrum for marketing purposes rather than at this end. So that's something we'll definitely keep an eye on in future years as well. Looking at who the buyers were, as in previous years, we've seen the largest volume supplied to European offset buyers. We've tracked that every year. North America has always been a significant buyer, but Europeans as a region have sourced the largest volume, and they're also the largest buyer of international offsets, so those offsets that come from projects in developing countries. Partly that's just because they're limited in that they can't generate domestic offsets because of the existing compliance cap, because of the European emissions trading system. But we also believe that a certain amount of that is due to the greater awareness of offsetting and comfort with offsets as a mechanism because of the presence of the emissions trading system. In North America, for the first time this year, we actually saw a decent proportion of offsets that were not supplied by domestic projects. Every year, North Americans have a tendency to buy the largest volume of their offsets from domestic projects, and we did see that shift slightly. And that's important, but it also has something to do with the available supply domestically, because a lot of offsets that were once available to purchase for voluntary purposes were being sort of reoriented to compliance buyers, and particularly because of the higher pricing associated with those buyers. So we saw a larger volume of landfill methane offsets being sold to North American buyers than in any other region. Still a significant volume of forestry. I think it was around half of the marketplace. So there is still some interest in other project types, but for North Americans looking for low-priced offsets, there was a big focus on landfill methane. Looking at the sectors that actually bought offsets last year, you can see, again, as I mentioned before, the offset resellers were the largest single buyer type. So those organizations that are buying offsets from projects and then reselling them to their clients. This is the latest in several years that we've seen that trend, with the market itself being the large source of supply, the demand, as well as supply on the retail side. Government was the second largest buyer this year. It's the first time that we've seen that happen in that volume, and a lot of that, as I mentioned, was KfW. But we also see some offset buying programs from other governments as well. South Korea is a notable one. They developed a voluntary program several years ago, and in order to kickstart domestic project development, the government actually committed to buy offsets. And they do so in the hundreds of thousands of tons every year. One of the things that we talk about in the report is the types of organizations below those two, which are sort of predictable, that engaged in offsetting last year in large volumes. So you can see finance, insurance companies, energy utilities, transportation, industrial processes. Some of them are company types that don't necessarily have a major consumer presence. And so we assume that part of their motivation for buying offsets is related directly to risk. You can see that those that have more of a consumer presence are a little bit further down the food chain. In terms of purchase motivations, again, resale is about a third of the market in terms of motivation. However, right behind it is that 20% that I mentioned before associated with pursuing a climate-driven mission, which is something that we've dug into a little bit in the report in terms of like talking to buyers about why that might be on the rise. But also important to notice here is the much smaller proportion of offsets that were transacted associated with pre-compliance motivations, and particularly for public relations and branding. Every year we've seen that sort of fall further down the list to the extent that it's one of the lowest motivations this year. And the fact that at the same time we've seen an increase in the volume of offsets that were transacted by buyers who are trying to tie projects directly to their supply chain and their suppliers and sphere of influence, we think that this points to a greater sophistication in terms of how buyers are making the business case for the offsetting activities that are in their budget. This last slide looks at our projections, and these are actually not our projections. They're projections of the offset suppliers who respond to the survey. So you can see this dark green bar that is on the left-hand side. That's the actual historical transacted volumes over time. And here we've pulled out compliance offset transactions or pre-compliance. And so this is looking at purely voluntary activities over time. And you can see that in aggregate, it actually equates to a 9% historical growth rate, which is reflected in that dotted bar on the right. And then you can see the 2013 survey predictions versus the 2014 survey predictions for the years looking ahead. While it looks like the market was a little bit more bearish last year than it has been in the previous year, we've seen that prediction go down every year. And we believe that at least part of that is the influence of having information like we present in the report, so that over time, offset suppliers have become a little more realistic about their expectations for market growth. The reason that it's still going up when you talk to suppliers is because they believe that the emerging domestic programs that we see in countries like Costa Rica and Thailand and Mexico, and through bilateral transactions or agreements like the one that we saw between KSLE and ACRE, that there is promise for greater offset demand in coming years. So I'm going to leave it at that and let our panelists respond to some of these findings, and I believe Michael is going to moderate. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to me or to my co-author, Gloria Gonzalez, who, I'm sorry, Gloria, I forgot to recognize you, but Gloria has done a lot of work on this report and unfortunately was not feeling very well, but otherwise would be up here telling you the other half of the story. So, thanks.
So before we open up to questions, I thought it would be great to have an opportunity to have three different lenses into the report, really three different types of organizations when you think about that stage slide that Molly presented. So I'll ask each of you to kind of respond to the report a little bit, and I'd like you to kind of focus in on a couple of things also. One is, you know, when you look into your crystal ball, what does it look like going out in your view? You know, the growth rate survey that Molly was talking about. Like what do you see in terms of what the future of this looks like. And then even kind of more specifically, when we think about, Paris in 2015, what would be an expectation that you would hold for that by the time we reach to Paris? Let's start first with Kristen Danaker, who is the Director of Forestry at the South Pole Group, a long-time sponsor and partner of ours in many ways, a project developer, and so he's kind of way low on that stages side. Also representing Colombia here, so we have a pretty good World Cup representation on this panel. But Kristen, go ahead. Tell us what your thoughts were.
Thanks, Michael. Actually, we are showing up on two bars in Molly's graph. One is the project developer graph, but the other one is also the wholesaler graph. Yeah. It's kind of a mix of both. And I think we have a fairly good view, positive view of last year. We saw two major trends against us. One is that average prices have come down across the board. And the other one was that the other foot of the carbon business, the CDM, crashed even more. But that also had some positive sides. One is that it was a good opportunity for some new market players to enter the market because it was easier to do so, because they knew how it goes, the prices are lower, and also from new countries like Colombian buyers that weren't really on the map before. And I saw one of those bars going into South America, and that's something that I didn't see last year on the map. So I think that's a good development as well. And the other one was there was also some exit of some players from the market, which might help others that don't exit like us to snap up some new business. We also saw that the more bulk sort of credits, such as Asian renewable energy and energy efficiency, seem to be in trouble on price, but they seem to be there to stay. Lots of buyers say, understand this. It's easy to communicate that they help to transition a country's energy grid to be more sustainable. So we have seen that the bulk of the credits are still coming from those renewable energy projects, albeit at a lower price. So in summary, good opportunity for those that add value and also bring some new ideas to the market. And so you asked for a crystal ball question, and I think my anticipated reply is that there is growth, but it's much more diversified into different products and different transaction types than before. It won't be VRs only. Some examples. For example, there's projects that generate several different environmental services or also several different normal commodities. And it looks like more and more those projects also have to be verified and reported and monitored on those outcomes beyond carbon. Even more than before. For example, we have a project that has also specific conservation outcomes. It has a goal to conserve 4 types of magnolia species, which is an endangered tree species in Colombia. So we're trying to get those conservation outcomes and the carbon outcomes under one hat. Or in another project, we're actually focused on food security, and we're trying to sort out food security, desertification issues, and carbon in the same project. And then we also have to communicate that to potential buyers, and we had to innovate there as well a little bit. For example, we had a drone fly up to the sky and take high-resolution imagery of the Magnolia project to show the people later on, this is where your tree stands. And we had to also adjust to the monitoring requirements of the buyers. They said, I want my Millennium Development Goals attained through my carbon offsetting activities, and therefore I also have to know how many women you have employed, how many jobs you have created, how many people you have lifted above the $1 per day threshold and so on. So in summary, again, I think there is growth. I agree that projections in the past were a little bit too ambitious, I would say, but the growth will be harder and harder to monitor because the budgets and the currencies that are showing up there will not only be carbon, and the budgets will not only be CSR, but they might be coming from the risk department, from the marketing department, or from other departments. We just had a buyer that bought VRs because they could deduct it from tax, and so we had to figure out how to claim those taxes back. That's not something we had to do before. So I leave it here.
Great, thank you, Christian. So moving on to Hans Wegner, who was the Chief Sustainability Officer for a long time at National Geographic Society, and we all know the National Geographic Society. We probably all don't know what they've been doing in this space, which is really quite impressive over the years. As they say, Hans is leading the Walk the Talk group there. So the same sort of, it'd be great to, he's a buyer, so when you think about the stages, he's at the end of the pipe there. And it would be great for you to think of, from your company's perspective, sort of where is all this going? And being a Washingtonian, you know, in the last couple of days, there was an article in the New York Times that was written by the Secretary of the Treasury during a Republican administration, Hank Paulson, that really came out very strongly for a carbon tax. That was maybe not unusual, except that it's kind of an unusual messenger, and maybe that's part of what I find hope in. And then obviously the ruling by the Supreme Court that gives the EPA the ability to monitor emissions out of coal plants. So, you know, tell me what your reactions were to this report, what you see from inside your company, and then maybe taking a step out of that, again, looking down the road a little bit, what do you see coming?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I have not been, as you say, the officer of the National Geographic for a very long time. We started this initiative in 2006 because I was concerned by the fact that we had this messaging out there where we talk about climate change and we talk about the depletion of resources, but we didn't really put into action what we were doing. And I thought it was really important for us as an organization to, given the fact that credibility is so important to who we are and what we report, that if we didn't do sustainability and become carbon responsible, that we lose credibility as an organization. So I started this organization of about 15 people that grew to 100 people, all volunteers doing this. And what we basically focus is on carbon. We conclude very quickly that there are lots of environmental pressures and environmental issues. The most important and the most compelling, and the one that's just landing on over everything else is carbon. And so we set out to measure our carbon emissions, and we have done so since 2007 when we started. And we systematically every year measure the carbon emissions of our organization, whether it's for the production of a magazine or the cost of a television hour or digital media that we have or a travel service that we provide. Whatever it is, we now measure it. The point of it is simply to be able to, once you measure and know what the impact is, that we could then address it. And basically, getting back to the question of what our view of carbon emissions and offsets is, boils down to the fact that we can do a lot in reducing our carbon emissions from the standpoint of Scope 1 emissions. Unfortunately, only 4% of our total carbon footprint at the National Geographic, and that includes suppliers of paper and suppliers of printing and stuff like that, only 4% of the emissions are ones that we can control. 96% are the ones that are emitted on our behalf by our suppliers. So the question becomes one of, what can we really do to reduce our emissions? And obviously, in the office, we can shut lights off, we can shut computers off, we can set the temperatures differently, we can use less water, all those kinds of things. But we can't really tell our suppliers that they have to use a different source of energy. So we conclude from the standpoint of the operations of our complex that we've done about as much as we can. We reduced our electrical consumption by about 16% in the last 8 years. We reduced our water consumption by 32% and our natural gas consumption by 23%. And now we're left where we really have to buy offsets. And so our mission is, our goal is always focused on what we can do to reduce what we use, that being the first step. And secondarily, what we have to do to offset what we cannot reduce. And we've focused in the past, for the building, for instance, we are buying renewable and wind energy credits, certificates. And so from that standpoint, we are exceeding the electrical current we use in the purchase of offsets so that we can not only cover what we use in this building, but we can also cover what was used in the rental properties that we have, where we lease office space in New York City or in Chicago and Los Angeles and San Francisco. So we cover the electrical footprint of the organization by buying wind credits. And we buy them directly from the developer of a wind farm. rather than buying it through electricity retailer. As far as natural gas is concerned, as I said, we've reduced that. We've been focusing on buying. Initially, we bought a reforestation program in Kenya that was to help to increase the size. The built forests have been depleted. We're currently buying a project in Panama, and what we look for in offsets is we look for not only are we getting in a forest project are we getting increased sequestration capacity, but we also look to see if it's reforestation or if it's a habitat project. What are the species that are maybe threatened or endangered, whether it be flora or fauna, that would benefit from this expansion of habitat? And so I look for what I call 2 for or 3 for. So I not only look for the carbon emissions gains that I get out of the project, but I also look for things that are attributes that protect endangered or threatened species. Again, these are flora or fauna. So those are the kinds of thrusts I look for. I'll tell you what this report indicates: that the prices have come down and the activity is down, the volume is down, and we obviously recognize that. And I think the good thing for people like us is that I think what it's doing is competition is also causing the value and the quality of the offsets out there to go up. So it's easier for me to find really high value and high quality offsets. And again, for me, it's really, really important, because credibility is so important to us as an organization, that we have everything that we document, that we have it third-party verified, that we purchase offsets that have high value and are accounted for and certified, so that we can, in all cases, document the value of the offsets we buy and make sure that they're entirely credible. The last thing I want is somebody coming here and walking around and saying, well, you know, this isn't really a valuable project, or this wasn't really properly certified, and I want to make sure that we do so in all cases. I also think that we're getting, one of the things that's a consequence of this is not only is competition bringing out more projects for us, bringing out more projects that are really highly valuable, but we're also getting more calls from people saying, we would really like to sell your assets. And so we're getting really good projects coming across the transom. What the problem for me is that we have gotten to the point where we've completely offset the emissions of what we do in Washington, including our business travel. And the philosophy we have on our business travel, rather than buying offsets as we travel, I aggregate all the trips that we do at the end of the year. And I look at the accommodations. We offset the accommodations. We offset the plane travel, and we offset rental cars. So we put a carbon value of all of that on an annualized basis, and we buy offsets. In the case of the travel, we are buying a RED project that is a carbon fund project in Accra, and has all other biodiversity and community values and benefits that we really appreciate. But I'm also looking at reducing the emissions for our suppliers, and I can talk to our suppliers, and I do talk to our suppliers, and particularly the paper suppliers, and they're basically saying we're going to switch our energy source from coal or natural gas or fuel oil to biomass. And so increasingly they're focusing on biomass as a way of getting their carbon emissions down. Now, I personally have a problem with biomass consumption, because I think there's a basic flaw in the analysis that says that's carbon neutral. That aside, we are working with our suppliers to have them become more efficient, and as I said, our paper suppliers do in fact now have, I think, an 80% biomass consumption. As far as our printer is concerned, what I did last year for the first time, I had them come to us, and this is for all our magazines, the National Geographic magazine, and the 3 titles. One is a travel magazine, 2 children's magazines, and all the catalogs we print. And I had them add up all of the electrical consumption associated with that business on the basis of their carbon emissions for their plant. And I also had them aggregate all of the natural gas use. I had them buy wind racks for the electrical consumption, and had them buy, I didn't dictate to them, I said, I want you to buy offsets, and I suggested that it makes sense to buy wind for electric consumption. And I suggested it would be useful for the natural gas consumption to use methane recapture out of landfills in equal volume. I then paid them for that. I reimbursed them for it. But I wanted them to get credit for the offsets against their emissions because their emissions don't impact ours. And I did that because I want them to take ownership of the fact that here's a business model that not only works for me, but it works for them because they can then sell this to their other customers. And hopefully if they can get 5 to 10% of their other customers to do likewise, they have a real impact on the carbon emissions, not only ours, but theirs. It hasn't yet materialized, unfortunately, because the guy I did the business with has left the company, and so I'm looking for somebody else to be a champion within that company. But that's kind of the approach. I'm getting a little bit away from where you were. But I think that the higher standards are the result of competition, and that's helping us with a lower price. And lower price does two things for me. It allows me to buy more offsets, especially those for our suppliers who are unable or unwilling to participate. But it also allows me to make the case with our senior management that we should set a goal, and we have set a goal, to be carbon neutral as a company for scope 1 through 3 in 4 years. We are down from our initial assessment in 2007 of 168,000 metric tons to 127,000 metric tons in 2012. Out of the 127,000 tons in 2012, we are offsetting 25%, most of which is scope 3 emissions. I'm not sure I helped you a lot, but
no, we can get back to this for sure. But thank you very much, Hans. And our final lens in is going to be Brian McFarland, who we're delighted that you're here, Director of Carbon Projects and Origination at carbonfund.org, and has been working very, very closely with ACRE, and I think that would be a great part of the story itself. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Brian McFarland. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak here this evening, especially with an accomplished panel and for a full house during the World Cup. So I really actually work for two organizations, and I'll just provide a little bit of brief background so you have some context for my later remarks. So the first organization I work for is carbonfund.org. Carbonfund.org was founded back in 2003, which makes it a bit of a grandfather in the voluntary carbon market space. And at our core is a nonprofit carbon offset retailer. So we purchase and retire certified carbon offset credits from projects in the energy efficiency, renewable energy, and forestry sectors on behalf of our donors. And these donors have historically consisted of, I'd say, about 750 to 800,000 individual supporters and about 2,000 business partners. One of these business partners, I'm proud to say, is National Geographic, that has really been doing some incredible work under Hans' leadership by not only supporting voluntary carbon projects, but also by engaging their supply chain and reducing emissions in their own operations. The second organization I work for is Carbon Co. Carbon Co. was founded back in 2011 as the wholly owned subsidiary of carbonfund.org. And Carbon Co. is primarily responsible for consulting engagements as well as the origination of RED projects in the state of Acre, Brazil. And Acre is viewed by many to be the leading or one of the leading jurisdictions working on RED issues as of today. And in Acre, I currently manage 5 RED projects on private properties that cover, I'd say, about 1 to 1.2 million acres. Now, last week I was asked to come up with some remarks on 3 different topics that I'll quickly touch upon. The first is my general reaction to this year's report findings on forestry offsets. The second, my thoughts on the California market from the perspective of a North American-based carbon offset supplier. And then 3, to talk a little bit about jurisdictional RED and Acre. I'm trying to do this really quick in under 10 minutes, but I'm certainly happy to answer any questions afterwards. So on that first point, in terms of my general reaction to this year's report findings on forestry offsets, to be honest with you, it really didn't surprise me that we saw an increase in the transaction volume of RED offsets, while the price of these RED offsets decreased. And I say that because there's a classic supply and demand mismatch in the RED offset space. So red projects involve substantial upfront costs that leads to the development of larger projects to cover these costs. And fortunately, a lot of these projects have been successful, and therefore there's been a substantial issuance of red offset credits. And on the flip side, the demand, although very much appreciated from voluntary donors, is simply not sufficient to support all the red projects being developed around the world. With that said, on a positive note, our donors have always been very supportive of forestry projects, and particularly red projects. We've seen an increase over the last couple of years, in particular the last 6 to 9 months for our red projects. And it's why we started originally developing a reforestation project in Nicaragua, followed by a reforestation project in Louisiana, and now we've got fire projects in the state of Acre, Brazil. And just one other point I want to make with respect to the price. I think it's very important to realize that red offset projects are not only competing against other red offset projects for buyers and for good pricing, but these red projects are also competing against other voluntary carbon projects, and red projects are competing against other land uses like cattle ranching, or palm oil, or soybean production. And these other land uses are far more lucrative, and I'd argue far easier to actually implement. So it's very important that red projects see a continuing increase in demand, as well as at stable prices that allow these red projects to be viable and sustainable in the long term. The second topic I'd like to briefly address being my thoughts on the California market from the perspective of a North American carbon offset supplier. To be honest with you, I've seen very little impact on Carbon Co. or Carbon Fund from the California market. And this is because both organizations are focused on the voluntary carbon market. So it's not like we've had donors switch suppliers because the donors in all cases have a compliance obligation. And we haven't had a lot of investors willing to take the risk of investing in our red projects for a future upside potential that a jurisdiction like California would accept red prices, and therefore they'd be able to on-sell at a higher price. But in terms of my view on California, I mean, it's very encouraging that California has so far rolled out a relatively successful emission trading scheme. It's very encouraging to see offsets, and particularly forestry offsets, not only accepted into California, but it's actually developed and issued, and now it can be used for compliance purposes. And there is an upside potential for Carbon Co. and for other developers of red projects that at some point in time, California could actually accept red offsets into their scheme. And that leads into the third topic I'd like to quickly talk about, and that is jurisdictional red. And so I apologize if I grossly oversimplify this, but for those of you who are unfamiliar with jurisdictional red, it's basically a higher level of accounting than what's done on the project level. So a jurisdiction, it could be a state or a province or a region or a country for that matter, basically accounts for land use change, and forest cover, both historically as well as forecasted into the future. And this is known as the jurisdictional baseline. And so that jurisdictional baseline, as well as the project baselines, are developed sort of in a similar fashion, then the projects can be nested or incorporated into the jurisdictional level. And this is ultimately very important because, one, a jurisdictional approach can help reduce individual project risk. Jurisdictional approaches can also help minimize or address the concept of leakage, which are the impacts that occur outside of a project's boundaries. And third, probably most importantly, is that if California is ever to accept international red offsets into its scheme, they're going to have to come from specifically a quote-unquote sector-based or sector-wide accounting apparatus, which is essentially what jurisdictional red is. And also, California really has a wonderful opportunity to become a global leader to demonstrate to other jurisdictions how red projects and red initiatives can supply high-quality offsets to a compliance mechanism, while also helping to simultaneously conserve some of our some of the last remaining tropical rainforests in the world. And so with that, just a couple quick things on jurisdictional red. In terms of the next steps, it wasn't specifically mentioned what date and which it was, but in California's latest scoping plan, it highlighted that California is still interested in potentially considering international red at a future date. So in terms of next steps, at some point in time, either the governor of California or the Air Resources Board will need to officially announce their intention to accept international red into California. From there, let's say the state of Acre, which is again one of the leading jurisdictions, the state of Acre and California would have to mutually recognize each other's programs, and then there'd have to be an official linkage of the two programs, kind of similar to what we saw with California and Quebec. And then there'd be also the technical and infrastructure development next steps in terms of deciding on exact protocols, methodologies, and certification standards, and that sort of stuff. In terms of barriers for jurisdictional reg, I would say the biggest barrier right now is the fact that the Air Resources Board is simply very, very busy with lots of competing priorities and protocols. The coal mine methane protocol was just recently approved. The rice cultivation protocol is now currently under review. So there's lots of different hurdles and protocols to be considered. There's still this pressure to only allow domestic offsets to supply the California market. And there's also some legal issues that are going to have to be eventually resolved, such as how would enforceability or invalidation risk work in this international context. And lastly, to wrap up my remarks, I was asked to briefly give an overview of sort of what to keep your eyes open for with respect to jurisdictional reg. And so first and foremost would be that announcement from, again, the government of California and the Air Resources Board that they've initiated the process. Undoubtedly, this will be reported by Ecosystem Marketplace, which I check on a regular basis. My fingers crossed, hoping to see that very announcement. And then there's a series of other sort of kind of secondary developments that could lend some insight into whether California, and if so, when, they would accept international reg. That would be the Mexican Forestry Protocol, and whether that provides a pathway for international forestry offsets, and particularly avoiding conversion forestry offsets to be accepted in California. The Air Resources Board is right now doing an invalidation review, and the result of that could demonstrate whether there's a dampening demand for offsets in the California market. Third, the second phase of California's emission trading scheme is going to start in 2015, and how that transition goes, whether the inclusion of additional sectors goes smoothly, and whether the demand for offsets increases, should shed some light on whether international reg offsets will be included. And then lastly, I would certainly keep your eyes open on the voluntary carbon markets, because if the voluntary carbon markets continue to shrink, then that's going to directly jeopardize the viability of carbon offset projects, and particularly REC projects. And so I think that's why it's very important for all of us to not only support, but to encourage the development of the voluntary carbon markets. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Cameron. Some interesting comments here that talked about, supply chain issues, quality going up, California, Governor Brown playing an important role, and some of the opportunities you see as the market kind of matures and maybe shrinks in some places and grows in others. So why don't we open up for questions? Molly, do you want to pop into here? And we have a couple of mics, right? Are these the mics that we're going to use?
No,
okay.
I think they're all. Yeah.
So, Mike, and if you could just
introduce yourself first, Jim.
And wait for the microphone as well. We do have folks on the webinar.
Thank you very much. Lars Kvaler with APX, so one of the registries that hopefully provided some useful input to the report and some of the numbers. And Molly and I have spoken about this before, but I'm glad you highlighted this difference between transactions and time and volumes. And you also mentioned you don't necessarily know when those transactions took place for retirements that happened last year. But from the registry side, we certainly have seen an increase in retirements last year as well as the first half of this year. And I think on one of your slides, and I think it's slide 20, which is also figure 7 on the executive summary, you may have a key to get to that analysis, because when you look at what's the buyer motivation and you look at what's the proportion that is for resale, right? If that proportion has changed over the years, that could give you an idea of, okay, what's the fundamental demand for the transactions that happen every year. So I'm not sure if that's going to be in the full report, but I would encourage that, because I think you can give that, if you have that series, you can actually get to whether that fundamental demand, which is really what Hansen National Geographic Society is doing, of buying these offsets, is happening. I guess from the panel, I'll be curious for Carbon Fund and South Pole as being retailers. We certainly see declining prices, but I'm not getting the feel that it's actually a decline in retirements. It's happening in some sense.
Well, it seems like a statement but I can comment on it. The relationship between transactions and retirements has always been challenging for us to link. And primarily because if we were to look at all of the different motivations that are out there, it's hard to say which of them are ultimately going to be for retirement or not. We see that with the larger volume of retirements that we've tracked over the last couple of years on registries that, these estimates that we had in the past that seemed like wild at the time, where half of the market was for retirement, those may actually be more realistic than we thought. And so the volume of offsets intended for retirement, the volume of offsets actually being retired, I think that that will remain at the level that we saw last year, which was fairly high. But it's again incredibly difficult to tie back to the volume of offsets that we see transacted. However, one of the reasons that we used to track retirement and now we purely report on registry activities and data from registries is because the data that they have is increasingly robust and representative of market activity, and particularly given the consolidation that we've seen over the last couple of years. So we'll continue to report on it and think of creative ways to tie it back to our data, but it's still something that we're working through.
I have a question. Hi, Molly. Isabel Hackman, Carbon Finance at the World Bank. Two questions for you. I was interested in knowing if you can break down, you had methane projects, but then you also had biogas separately from that. And so the methane projects, on the voluntary side, are they coal mine methane? Because I'm thinking they're probably not landfills, right? If you have examples of the voluntary methane projects that are not biogas, because they seem to be separate. And also, just for my personal interest, is when you're looking at buyers, is the World Bank considered a buyer, or are the fund participants of the World Bank considered the buyers? What kind of statistics are you getting from us? I'd be interested in knowing that.
Right. So with respect to methane, there's actually a couple of different product types that we track there. There's agricultural methane, coal mine, landfill methane, primarily in the U.S. Seems like there's another one. Wastewater, yeah, wastewater methane. I don't think we saw much of that this year. And then we also have write-in options for product type, and that's where the biogas comes from. And if we can't get someone to tell us more specifically what it is, then we have to report it separately or in the other category. But if they actually tell us what it is, even if it's just as specific as biogas, then we try to include it if it's significant enough. So we don't know what kind that is. But we actually in the pie chart that you saw, we do separate out the different kinds of methane. And with respect to the World Bank as a buyer, we haven't had to, well, actually we did when the Biocarbon Fund was supporting the development of afforestation and reforestation projects in its first and second tranches. And in terms of the data that we collected, the person who was responding on behalf of the bank broke down the information about the types of investors in the fund. So what proportion of it was public sector, country level, what proportion of that was private. That was the only time we've ever really had to deal with that. Obviously with the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, any future IRPAs that are signed through that fund, the Carbon Fund, we would hope to have that same level of detail, knowing that there is at least some small proportion of private sector activities in that.
Sam Teicher from the White House Council on Environmental Quality. First of all, thank you to the work you guys have done on the report and also to the panelists for being here. Brian and I actually got to see you speak at the Yale Forestry Tropical Foresters Conference, so it's nice to hear you talk again. So I had several questions. First, Looking into your crystal ball or also at recent news stories, I'm wondering if you guys can comment on how you see forest conservation trending with regards to new or potential regulations. And second, to your report, I saw that the breakdown where you had 45% was forest and land trends and so on and so forth. Are you guys seeing any emergence of blue carbon, mangroves or coral reefs or anything, seagrass beds along those lines? If that's something that's emerging more since it's sort of a new field.
Okay. Well, maybe I can take the second question and then turn the first back over to the foresters in the room. Blue carbon, it depends on how you define it. So we have seen an increase in project development and interest in those activities, at least in North America, under programs like the American Carbon Registry. We've done a lot of coverage of their deltaic wetlands restoration methodology and the projects being developed under that, and the relationship that they have with Entergy as a local utility supporting that program. More broadly, we've tracked programs like the Livelihood Fund, which was actually formed in collaboration with the Ramsar Convention, and has always had a focus on blue carbon. The challenge within our data is that if there are only 1 or 2 responses, we can't report them in a disaggregated fashion. So, even if there was like 1 million tons of something, if it would be only 1, then we can't break it out. So those projects tend to be lumped into the other land use category. If you look at that, you can assume that most of that is wetlands. But particularly with programs like the Danone Livelihoods Fund, they classify that as afforestation, reforestation. And so when you're looking at that particular category, you'll see some blue carbon as well. We haven't, because those activities are so few and far between, we haven't really had an opportunity to break them out separately, but it's certainly something that we will do if it gains any more traction in North America.
I'll try to take the other question. I think there's some progress on regulatory schemes that provide support for conservation. One is, of course, kind of the disaggregated different countries doing their own schemes. For example, Australia, we just issued the first 160,000 compliance red credits in Australia and sold them to Australian buyers. So there's some movement in those local schemes, and there's a couple of others that are allowing for this. We also see that there is more activity going on by governments in different countries, figuring out how they can generate some sort of compliance grade forestry or agriculture-related credits, but no one really knows what it's called yet. One is through NAMAs, through the National Appropriate Mitigation Actions, where, for example, Tunisia is working on a forestry NAMA. In Honduras, they're looking at agricultural NAMAs. In Colombia, they look at afforestation NAMAs. So there could be, and NAMA is supposed to be a scheme where the government and the country itself also has some goals, and they don't have to sell necessarily all those credits to some other country. So hopefully there would be some demand for some sort of compliance tonnage in the forestry sector coming from there. And finally, of course, the big question is, what are we agreeing on in Lima or in France? My personal crystal ball is that there will be some sort of international scheme that will have some sort of red CER coming up, but it can be 10 years down the road or even longer. You don't really know, but I'm positive on it.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Christian. The only thing else I'd add is I'm an optimist, and I do believe that both Mexico and Australia will supply red credits to California. Certainly not today or tomorrow, but maybe I don't want to have an exact date, but maybe 2017, 2018, definitely years down the road.
I will just add sort of the unknown category of countries looking at forestry are those in Asia that are developing domestic regulated carbon programs. And we know that forestry is under consideration in some Chinese provinces. We just got back from a trip in South Korea where we were talking to the government about their intentions related to forestry offsets and the development of methodologies, which they're supporting in their early stages. So, so we know that it's out there. It's going to be, I think, primarily domestic-facing programs. So not necessarily opportunities that the international carbon market would be able to engage in unless they have a presence in those places, but are nonetheless significant.
Let me just chime in. From the buyer standpoint, especially given who we are trying really hard to be much more active in promoting reforestation. And I'm talking not so much in terms of reforesting where we've harvested, which is under most protocols required, but reforesting land that was converted at some point in the past and is now being reforested. And my sense is that, well, if we have any chance, if we're going to have any chance of becoming of achieving carbon balance, we have to start approaching the forest cover that existed here 100 years ago, maybe more than 50 years ago, because if you're talking about the last time the planet was carbon neutral, we have to grow more forest. And so I'm really motivated to find projects where we're not only growing more forest, but we expand habitat for endangered species. We have a group of the National Geographic funds, what we call emerging explorers, people who are doing really cool projects worldwide. There are two projects we're trying to get certified, which involve one in South Africa and the other one in Tanzania. The one in South Africa involves an emerging explorers of the National Geographic, who's now, who receives funding from the society, who was focused on a species of parrot that is disappearing. It's disappearing because its habitat is disappearing, and its food source in the habitat is disappearing. And so we're working with Native Energy to try to come up with a carbon project that will reforest the habitat for that species of parrot in South Africa and Botswana, and hoping thereby not only to have a larger forest sequestration capacity, but also to give a chance to this parrot species, which is threatened. And so we're working with Native Energy. We directed them to see if they can certify this project, and if they do, if they're capable of it, and if they qualify it, we will look into buying offsets from that project.
Let's just take a couple more questions. I'm conscious of the time here. John in the back.
Well, each year this is this. Oh, I'm sorry, John Lewis, Terra Global Capital. This gets more and more interesting and sifting out more and more issues. So, congratulations for this process. And so I'm emboldened to dig a little deeper. We see the CCB certified VCS credits. We know all about those, especially. That's pretty much everything we try to do. But how much of those other credits also involve things like community forest management, or what used to be called forest co-management? Because there's this whole other wave, and some of us, but I don't see too many, were in this other meeting from this Forest Trend Spin-off Organization Rights and Resources Initiative, where if you said you do red, people would sort of walk away from you. And carbon cowboys, we heard about private land in Acre, but a lot of these forests are more and more, of course, under pressure from small farmers who can be incentivized to protect those forests. And that gets to the second part of my question, which is that requires buffer zones, and buffer zones would then have non-timber forest products or some sort of value chain that would incentivize keeping a tree-based agriculture or perennial agriculture, without which 9 billion people on this planet are not going to get back to what the National Geographic correctly cited as what has to happen. So would there be a way of tracking co-benefit red or co-benefit afforestation, reforestation, as opposed to just pure gardening. Along with, as I said before, the forest co-management beyond the CCPA standardized thing, and the last twist to what may be two questions or two sides of the same question is how much of the carbon is being bought by companies that are also enjoying a regular supply of some of these non-timber forest products that are getting increasingly more valuable and increasingly hard to find, like cocoa, for example. And they would have every reason to go in and want to buy the carbon because that's shading the finer flavor chocolate cocoa, for example. Now that's a lot to ask of your data, but maybe we'll see all that break down next year.
And when, Shanna, you get the closing question here. If you can remember those. I think there were like 6 or 7 questions in there, John. One question.
All right. I was intrigued by the confluence of two things, the increase in motivation to buy based on a climate-driven mission, and also what you said, Molly, about seeing strong demand from Europe where there is this experience with the regulated carbon market and offsets there, whether it be kind of more comfort among and sort of demand for that sort of responsibility among consumers, stakeholders, as well as maybe more capacity generally around to be able to navigate the carbon markets and such. So I wonder, given those two things, is there an opportunity, for example, with California coming on board to give a boost to the carbon market? And is there something that, given the experience of the panel, you see leaders in the field doing, or that the market could do better to be able to leverage those two kind of promising aspects of the market?
Okay, so starting with John, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, we don't apply any kind of filters or screens to the offsets that are reported to us. So, you know, when it comes to talking about the quality of the projects or specific things about them, because we have to aggregate our data for confidentiality purposes, there's some things that we simply can't dig into too deeply. And we have to assume that there's quality associated with the CCB certification and all of the things that they require. That said, we know that there is a significant interest among buyers in supporting projects with co-benefits and that demonstrate on an ever-increasing basis their contribution to communities and local biodiversity. And this is the first year that we've actually asked projects what their co-benefits are. So what are the species that are protected? How many people were employed in this year? Et cetera, et cetera. But there aren't currently any good methodologies for tracking co-benefits. And if you look at the kinds of reports that have come out over the last year, ICROA, the International Carbon Reduction and Offsets Alliance, put out a report that that looked at that. The Gold Standard put out a report trying to value co-benefits. But generally, I don't think that market tracking organizations are going to get a good handle on that until certification bodies have a better handle on it. There's just not a lot out there. But we will report on what we can report on objectively, and we're trying to dig more into that. So you'll actually see some of that in the Forest Carbon Markets report this year, which we'll be putting out this fall. With respect to awareness-driven demand, I don't really know how else to put it. You know, every year we see people who are surprised that Europeans are the largest buyers because a lot of them, particularly energy utilities, already have a compliance obligation. And so those organizations are buying above and beyond what they're actually required to. The sort of compliance obligation becomes the new baseline or the new normal. And there we also see small and medium-sized enterprises buying offsets, which we don't really see in North America yet. And a lot of demand in Europe actually comes from those smaller companies that are not necessarily the big multinationals that we see buying in North America, like Disney or Microsoft. And so one of the things that we talk about in the report is that we do expect to see more of that awareness-driven offsetting in North America if programs like California's are successful and are able to sort of establish roots. But that may not happen immediately because of a lot of the turmoil and debate that's been going on over the last over a year with various lawsuits and challenges to the program, uncertainties, whatever. Once that settles down, we expect to see more of a sort of everyman interest in it.
I can try to make the link between the two questions. We actually had one of those small European companies that bought some credits from a project we have in Zimbabwe, which is the large red project. They bought the carbon credits and the honey, which is precisely the product that the local communities produce to have some income without cutting down the trees. So in that Carrillo project, they have produced 1,200 pounds of honey in the first year of the project. They raised productivity by 25% through conservation agriculture, and that's precisely why that buyer was interested, because they're not just kind of locked out of the forest and they can't touch it, but actually they were in the middle of it and they would only stop cutting it down for agriculture if they could produce something on their existing land.
I'll also add, I forgot about that part of the question. You can see the proportion associated with the food and beverage industry. And every year, what is that, 3%? Most of that is in the forestry sector. So that is one of the sectors where we see a strong connection between our supply chain.
It's kind of the opposite. I see very little sort of connection between supply chain and who are primary donors. Our largest donors tend to be in the consumer electronic industry, so a lot of companies like Dell, Motorola, Samsung, LG, and there's also quite a bit of our donors that come, I guess, from like the transportation sector, so like Amtrak, Virgin America, JetBlue, so not really like food and beverage, agricultural type firms donating and investing in our projects.
Great. Well, with that, I'm going to thank our panelists again, and Molly, great job on the report this year as always. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Hans. Thank you, Brian. Thank you all for coming, and thank you particularly Mark and Han Williams for providing wonderful space. We do have some drinks. We're going to celebrate the victories of Cote d'Ivoire and Colombia, fourth country World Cup. So thank you all very much.
Thanks again. Great panel. Are you I'll do one.